Has the market changed its mind about what the Fed may do next?
My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2%
Hello,
goal.
welcome to Finance Stockholm. I'm Chris Crystal, and today is Friday, September 23rd, and it's 2022, and we have a continued slide in the market. Doesn't look like it'll stop anytime soon. We've had a lot of events moving on us, and in the Swedish market, I think probably some of the more important events to pay attention to are, of course, our forthcoming government, the inflation cycle here, and that's tied mainly to the energy. And then on top of the energy, you also have the issue of how the local banks are handling this. Of course, we saw all the local banks, and this is pretty much global. Everybody's raising rates. Turkey was an exception, but also you see readjustment thanks to the risk profile for investing being adopted in many different forms. So like Handelsbanken now has a equity strategist employed just to handle trading in the market. And they're going with an avoid on the high exposure to the interest rates. So the builders, and then of course the biotechs are still getting some action here, but when you're looking at the cyclicals and you're looking at these industrials, these are the ones that are generally they're saying to avoid, and they're saying to stick with the companies like that are selling the goods, so the daily food suppliers. On top of that, you have the other telecoms. Of course, dividends here play a big factor because of all the foundations that we have and the payouts to those foundations. But that's a significant development. And so you see the big banks reacting that way. But yesterday, we only had 3 movers on the OMX 30S that were up. So it was Nordea. You also had Swedish Match was up marginally, and the mining company Boliden. So that's these are the big movers, the 3 of them, and they were barely eking out anything close to 0.3 to 1% on the day. And so with the German PMI coming out, the French PMI, everything looking slower and being impacted negatively by the energy. This is no news or anything that's significant, not rocket surgery. The market is clearly in for some trouble. You see many of the companies coming out with profit warnings. FedEx on the back of theirs last week is raising prices on freight over 6%. That we'll see how that affects them, if it will actually manage the cost increase, and if they can show any profitability there. Similarly, on one of the supermarket chains here in Sweden, Axffod, yesterday got absolutely hammered in the market because of the cost issue and talking about profitability. So we did see a lot of companies still coming out yesterday where they were doing rights offerings to finance their acquisitions. And so like Securitas is doing a rights offering. You had Acast, which was going to be doing a rights offering. And I say going to be doing, I don't know what their forecasts are, if they're continuing or they're on the same timetable. But you still have quite a few different pharmaceutical and biotech companies going through on the proposed rights offerings for in order to get cash into the coffers. But the changed risk profile is going to lead many to be on the sidelines and watching and waiting. And so if we go back to the energy issue, in Sweden we just had our elections, and so with the coalition party coming in, which is led by the Moderaterna, who would be our prime minister, and that would be Ulf Kristersson, and then you have the Liberalerna and others. You have a group that has said that they would protect the Swedish consumer on the high electricity cost, and the date proposed for this was by November 1st, and that was put in part of the campaign promises. But at this point, it doesn't look achievable to have this protection in place for the Swedish consumer. And so what that really means in a very simple way is that the average Swedish consumer who holds a 30-year mortgage on their house will now be paying a double mortgage. So they're going to pay their mortgage rate, and then they're going to also pay their electricity bill. And if you look at the cost on the electricity, it's equal to or higher in a lot of cases than their electricity bill. I mean, than their mortgage bill. And so if you think about it that way, a lot of the consumers here in Sweden will be paying double mortgage. And the question is, how many of the consumers can continue to do this, and at what period of burn can they do this before they are forced to sell their house or lose their house? So this adds to the uneasiness about the Swedish economy. We already saw a contraction, and the question is, how much will this continue? Next week in Sweden, we're rolling out our energy saving plans. So the energy ministry has already come out and said that, and this is very negative, that the Swedish consumer can no longer take the price of electricity for granted as being cheap or cheaper. So we now have to go through this pain. So, and in Sweden, the average person is paying they're paying over 40% in tax, income tax. Many are paying over 50. And you're paying a very high level of tax. And the idea is that you have a good standard of living. And many people do own a summer home or travel abroad during their vacations and live a fairly good standard of life. But now with this, the promise and the contract by the people voted into the party, who have been closing down nuclear plants for quite some time. In total, Sweden has closed 7. So today we only get 40% of our electricity generation from nuclear power. All right. The previous government that's going out closed 4. The German government owns Uniper. Uniper owns stakes in Sweden tied to our power production. And now there's a fear that Germany may try to influence our forthcoming power generation. So right now everything looks fine, and you have comments coming out from the party, the Moderaterna party, where the prime minister is going to be from, where the debate about the energy cost and the power production are said to be, don't worry, we're working on it and we're going to help you, and we're going to fulfill our promises. Now, I don't know who's heard that before, but we'll see what happens. And it's a very interesting strategy on that side, because the clear run has been at renewables. Those are the windmills, which clear away a lot of forest land to do it. And the environmental impact there is not really understood by many. We can do a separate discussion on that, so people understand more what happens when you put in a windmill. For instance, when you're putting in the cabling to connect it to the network, the electrical power grid, this is a significant undertaking that needs to be understood. And then when you're putting in solar, and how effective it is, and what the return on the rate is in terms of the energy production. So, but right now the energy ministry is saying to the Swedish population, get ready for next week. Do your laundries on the weekend when the electricity is cheaper. But if everybody's using it at the same time, then maybe the electricity prices will spike. So we'll see what happens there. And then, of course, you're going to have to look at other energy saving methods. And that's the idea from the energy ministry. Like, this is what you're going to get, and you better learn to live with it. So, we'll see how this develops. But interestingly, we do have a company that's called Ingrid Capacity, and this is in the business section today, talking about building out a 70 megawatt battery station outside of a small town called Karlshamn. And there's no real timeline given on if it'll be completed within a year or 5 years. They do have another target for another project, which will build 2 megawatts in the north of Sweden. And that'll be in a 5-year target. And then that is supposed to take place in 5 years. And we'll see how that develops. And that is, but the project for 70 megawatts is going to be 70 to 75, is going to be around 300 to 350 million Swedish Kronor. And they're building it with a company called Engelbrekt. So even though you want to, quote unquote, avoid these companies during this cycle because nobody's sure how many buildings are going to be built in Sweden and the high interest costs associated for them and the development, maybe this could be one to take a look at just as an example and to understand how the market's going to be affected. But if you take one of our smaller cities in Sweden, it's called Uppsala, and they use something like 3,000 terawatt or 3 terawatts per annum. And if you can think about that and the production being produced by these battery companies, we're not meeting needs. And the idea of converting over from diesel cars to electrical cars by 2035, we've got a lot of catch up to do to meet those goals. And the Swedish climate goals are really at risk. So if they're actually serious about meeting the goals, they're way behind the timetable. And if you run a corporation, you fire employees who don't deliver. And we've already seen that governments that aren't delivering what the voters want are starting to get fired. So we'll see how much of this trend develops and if it worsens over the next few years or if it improves. And then on top of that, just in market news in general, it's generally all negative. You do see a lot of downgrades. One of our big players, Ericsson, of course, is getting hit because they continue to have trade in Russia, or they're selling equipment there. SAS failed to fully disclose the situation of the pilot strike, so they're getting some questions. And then last year's darling, this year's ugly duckling, Klarna, which has been showing a loss of home ground territory in terms of improvement in the market. You see that they've had losses on the books, or that the running cost is significantly higher than they thought. They're now downsizing again, and so it's not clear how many employees they'll actually have. And as they're a new technology company, they went with the trend of letting people know they're going to be fired, and they did this via digital transmission. So they got an email, and they got an invite, and then they got a video saying, hey, get ready to get fired. And it should be for about 500 people. And while I think that's tragic and it's terrible for these people, I think it really shows you when you're looking at companies, you really have to dig in and understand the management behind it. Because Klarna not only has those problems, but here locally in Sweden, they've had a lot of problems with the union. And the union is not seen in the same way as many see it in America. The union is seen here as really your cooperative partner to help you maintain a good standard of job and living. And so it's a very kind of symbiotic relationship. Whether or not they're meeting up to that standard, that's a different story. But the unions have problems with Klarna and have had problems with Klarna. Klarna likes to say that all the employees that have been fired thus far have found new jobs because, of course, they hired top people, so they were immediately recruited to other companies. But they didn't say it exactly like that, but it's similar. So Klarna continues to be in trouble. But to note, while IKEA is doing incredibly well in the United States, and IKEA is doing very well here in Sweden, every time I go to the store, it's generally full. Doesn't matter if it's during the weekday or on a weekend. You see good traffic flow, and they're improving on their app and so forth. But when you use the electronic app and so forth, and when you check out, Klarna is an option. And so we'll see if Klarna can maintain large clients like ICA for their web shopping. And so the market in general continues to be turbulent. We have a lot of conditions that are impacting the market that are not just tied to the risk rate and what the current interest levels are. You do see developing social unrest. I mean, if you're reading in the newspaper in the United States, there's regularly shootings or crazy acts of violence occurring. But importantly for us here in Sweden, we've passed a milestone, which is that we had 48 shooting deaths this year. So we've hit a significant milestone, and we continue to see bombings on a nightly basis, or at least a weekly basis. We've had 2 in a row for the last 2 days. So the last one that went off was in Helsingborg, and now we've seen another one going off, and that was farther north up near Stockholm. But these are all tied to more on the drug war. So it's a lot of the drug dealers attacking each other. But if their market is that good that they want to take over each other's power, maybe that's a sign of or an indication of what's happening to society, that people are using or self-medicating with these pharmaceuticals. So there is a bit to pay attention to, because we don't have a government yet. We're working on getting our government in place. They have a number of goals to achieve. And so the Swedish currency and how it continues, a good way to gauge what the Swedish currency is going to do is look at the expanded multiple, or the price to earnings multiple trading on a lot of our industrial companies. And there you can see how our currency will further develop. Is a method I've used in the past and would recommend to many people to keep an eye on. So that would be it, and wish everybody a great weekend. Maybe to have a better week or weekend, don't look at the market. So we'll talk to you after the weekend. Thank you very much.